By 2026, a major financial crisis was already shaping everyday American life, even though almost no one could clearly name it. It wasn't debated during elections, it wasn't framed as an emergency. It didn't appear as a single-line item in economic reports. Yet it affected households across income levels, regions, and political beliefs in the same quiet way, by making ordinary life more fragile, more expensive, and more uncertain than it had been just a few years earlier. This crisis didn't involve banks failing or markets crashing. It involved something far more fundamental: protection itself becoming unreliable. Health insurance, home insurance, auto insurance, systems designed to reduce risk, began behaving like additional sources of risk. Coverage still existed on paper, but the practical ability to use it without long-term consequences steadily eroded. Premiums rose faster than wages. Deductibles expanded beyond what many households could realistically absorb. Coverage narrowed through exclusions, conditions, and administrative barriers. The result was not a loss of insurance, but a loss of confidence in what insurance actually meant. What makes this moment difficult to recognize is that nothing visibly collapsed. People continued paying, policies renewed. Claims were processed slowly, selectively, and often unpredictably. From the outside, the system appeared intact, but functionally, its role had changed. Insurance was no longer a safety mechanism that allowed people to recover from disruption. It became a system that forced people to avoid disruption at all costs. That shift fundamentally altered behavior long before it ever showed up in headlines. This is why the issue never became a campaign topic. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't centralized. It didn't lend itself to slogans or simple blame. Instead, it operated through math, probability, and gradual recalibration. Risk increased, costs followed, protection became conditional, and responsibility stopped guaranteeing security. By the time 2026 arrived, many Americans were insured, compliant, and still exposed, managing life by minimizing claims rather than relying on coverage. This video is not about political failure or corporate misconduct in isolation. It's about how a system designed for stability responded to overlapping pressures: climate risk, healthcare inflation, legal costs, labor shortages, by quietly transferring uncertainty downward. The question is not whether insurance still exists. The question is whether it still performs the role it was built for. And by 2026, that answer had begun to change in ways most people felt, but few fully understood. Most people don't remember the exact moment this started, and that's part of the problem. There was no headline day, no emergency announcement, no dramatic crash that forced everyone to look in the same direction at once. Instead, it showed up quietly, folded into everyday life, disguised as routine paperwork and renewal notices. An email that said your policy has been updated. A letter that arrived looking almost identical to last year's, except the number at the bottom was higher. Not shocking enough to panic, not outrageous enough to protest, just expensive enough to make you pause, exhale, and quietly accept it. By 2026, millions of Americans weren't asking whether they could afford luxury or comfort anymore. They were asking whether they could afford to stay protected at all. And the strange part is that almost everyone felt this pressure individually, as if it were a personal failure, never realizing it was happening everywhere at the same time. Insurance used to be one of the invisible pillars of American life. You paid it, you forgot about it, and you trusted that if something went wrong, the system would catch you before you fell too far. It wasn't exciting, and it wasn't supposed to be. It was stability in its most boring form. But somewhere along the way, that boring safety net began to transform into something else entirely. By 2026, people weren't just paying more for insurance, they were paying more while receiving less, and worse, they were living with a constant fear of using the very thing they were paying for. The coverage still existed on paper, but the confidence was gone. Deductibles climbed high enough to make filing a claim feel like a gamble. Exclusions multiplied quietly, approval processes slowed. And what used to feel like protection began to feel like a risk calculation. What makes this moment so unsettling is how normal it looks from the outside. Neighborhoods didn't suddenly empty, highways still filled with cars. Hospitals stayed open, life continued, but underneath that surface normalcy, people began making subtle, defensive decisions. They drove more carefully, not because they wanted to, but because a single accident could trigger premium increases they couldn't absorb. They ignored small leaks in their homes, not because they didn't care, but because they were afraid of what a claim might do to their policy. They postponed doctor visits, not because they didn't need care, but because they didn't know what would actually be covered anymore. Being insured no longer meant being safe. It meant being exposed in a different way. By the time 2026 arrived, this quiet shift had already reshaped how people thought about risk. Insurance wasn't reducing anxiety anymore, it was creating it. Every interaction felt adversarial. Every claim felt like a test, every renewal felt like a judgment. And because none of this happened all at once, there was no collective response, no marches, no unified outrage, just millions of people adjusting downward, privately recalibrating their expectations of what life could throw at them and how much damage they could survive. That's how a system changes behavior without ever announcing that it's broken. The most disturbing part is how easy it was to miss. Political campaigns focused on wages, taxes, housing, and jobs, loud, visible problems with clear slogans attached. Insurance didn't fit that format. It was fragmented, technical, and boring. It didn't belong to one industry or one villain. It didn't explode. It accumulated. And because of that, it slipped through every debate and every promise. But by 2026, its impact was undeniable in daily life. People with stable jobs, decent incomes, and long work histories were discovering that stability didn't protect them from vulnerability anymore. The old assumption that responsibility and consistency would buy security quietly stopped working. This wasn't about recklessness or bad decisions. Many of the people feeling the squeeze did everything right. They bought homes they could afford. They maintained clean records. They followed the rules. And yet, year after year, the cost of staying insured climbed faster than their ability to keep up. The system didn't punish failure, it punished exposure. The more you needed protection, the more expensive it became. And in a country built around risk sharing, that inversion carried consequences far beyond balance sheets. By 2026, the hidden crisis wasn't that insurance had vanished. It was still there, technically. The crisis was that it had changed its relationship with ordinary life. It no longer functioned as a buffer between people and disaster. It became another pressure point, another monthly calculation, another source of quiet dread. And because it never arrived with sirens or breaking news banners, most people didn't recognize it as a crisis at all. They just felt more cautious, more tense, and more alone navigating risks that used to be shared. This is where the story really begins, not with collapse, but with the slow realization that the safety net beneath everyday America had thinned so much that no one trusted it to hold anymore. What made this crisis so difficult to recognize was not its scale, but its personality. It didn't look like a disaster. It didn't arrive with a date, a name, or a single point of failure that could be replayed on the news. It behaved like background noise, always present, rarely acknowledged, easy to ignore until it became impossible not to feel. By the time people started talking about insurance in 2026, they weren't asking what went wrong. They were asking why no one ever warned them. And the uncomfortable truth is that this was never a problem that fit the way America talks about problems. Insurance doesn't make for good speeches. It's technical, fragmented, and deeply unglamorous. There is no single system to point at, no clear villain to rally against, no dramatic moment where everything breaks at once. Health, home, auto, all operate under different rules, different regulators, different timelines. That fragmentation made the pressure invisible at the national level, even as it intensified locally and personally. Politicians prefer problems that can be framed, simplified, and resolved within an election cycle. Insurance offers none of that. It's slow, it's math-driven, and it forces uncomfortable conversations about risk, cost, and limits, conversations that don't translate into applause lines. By the time campaigns ramped up in the mid-2020s, the insurance problem was already well underway, but it didn't register as urgent. Costs rose incrementally, not explosively. Coverage narrowed through fine print, not announcements. Deductibles crept upward quietly, year after year. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. From the inside, people were making trade-offs they had never expected to make. But because those decisions happened privately, at kitchen tables, on phone calls with agents, in unread policy documents, There was no visible crisis for cameras to capture. What can't be filmed rarely becomes a priority. There was also a deeper reason this issue never reached the center of public debate. Addressing it would have required admitting limits. Insurance is a promise built on probabilities, and by 2026, those probabilities were shifting faster than anyone wanted to say out loud. Climate risk, healthcare costs, legal inflation, repair labor shortages, none of these trends were temporary. A serious conversation about insurance would have forced leaders to acknowledge that some risks were becoming uninsurable at old prices, and that someone, somewhere, would have to absorb the difference. That's not a message campaigns are eager to deliver. It's far easier to talk about growth than about constraint, so instead, the issue stayed diffuse. Each increase could be explained away, each denial could be blamed on a clause. Each premium hike could be framed as an adjustment. No single moment justified outrage. And because the pain was spread unevenly, a little more here, a little more there, it never crossed the threshold required to become a national emergency. People didn't feel robbed, they felt worn down. And exhaustion doesn't organize itself into movements. By 2026, this avoidance had created a strange paradox. Insurance was more essential than ever, yet less trusted than at any point in modern memory. People depended on it for everything: healthcare access, housing stability, mobility, while simultaneously assuming it would fail them when it mattered most. That kind of relationship breeds quiet behavioral change, not rebellion. People adapt, they delay care. They avoid claims, they absorb damage themselves. The system doesn't collapse, it hardens. And from the outside, that hardening can look like resilience, even when it's actually retreat. The absence of political focus wasn't accidental, but it wasn't a conspiracy either. It was a reflection of incentives. Problems that move slowly don't reward bold intervention, they punish it. Any attempt to address insurance costs would have produced immediate backlash from one side or another, while the benefits would have arrived gradually and unevenly. In a system calibrated for short-term wins, long-term stabilization rarely survives. So the issue remained untouched, quietly compounding in the background while attention shifted to louder, more dramatic crises. This is how a structural problem becomes normalized. When no one names it, it feels personal. When no one debates it, it feels inevitable. And by the time 2026 arrived, millions of Americans had internalized a reality that was never officially acknowledged. Protection had become conditional, fragile, and expensive in ways that no election ever prepared them for. The crisis wasn't hidden because it was secret. It was hidden because it was inconvenient, too slow to panic over, too complex to promise away, and too revealing about the limits of the system to confront head-on. By the time 2026 arrived, the pressure that had been building quietly for years finally crossed an invisible threshold. Nothing formally broke, but something changed in how the system behaved and how people experienced it. The increases were no longer occasional or explainable as one-off adjustments. They became frequent, synchronized, and relentless. Renewals jumped in ways that felt disconnected from personal history or behavior. Longtime customers with clean records saw the same treatment as newer high-risk ones. The message, though never stated directly, was clear. The rules had shifted, and loyalty no longer mattered. This is why 2026 felt different. It wasn't the beginning of the insurance breakdown, it was the moment it became unavoidable. Multiple pressures that had been building independently began stacking on top of each other. Climate-related losses were no longer regional anomalies. They were recurring, widespread, and increasingly expensive to model. Healthcare costs didn't just rise, they layered. New treatments, aging populations, staffing shortages, administrative complexity, all of it compounded. At the same time, the cost of repairs surged. Materials were more expensive, skilled labor was harder to find. Legal costs expanded quietly in the background. Every claim, no matter the category, cost more to resolve than it did just a few years earlier. Insurance doesn't respond to stress emotionally, it responds mathematically. When the probability of loss rises and the cost of each loss increases, premiums follow. By 2026, that equation left very little room for cushioning. Risk stopped being spread generously and started being priced precisely. The system moved from absorption to exclusion. Areas once considered safe became borderline. Behaviors once rewarded became irrelevant. The old model, where large pools could comfortably offset individual losses, began to strain under the weight of overlapping risks that were no longer rare or isolated. What made this moment especially jarring was how suddenly the consequences appeared in ordinary life. People who had never filed a claim saw dramatic increases anyway. Others discovered that coverage they assumed existed had quietly changed. Deductibles rose to levels that made small and medium losses functionally uninsured. The concept of being covered fractured. Technically, policies were active. Practically, many people realized they would only use them in the event of catastrophe, and even then, they weren't sure what would happen. Insurance stopped functioning as a tool for resilience and started acting as a last-ditch option, something you hoped never to test. 2026 also marked a shift in how insurers communicated. Language became colder, more automated, more distant. Decisions arrived by algorithm, not conversation. Appeals felt opaque. Explanations were technically correct but emotionally empty. The human element thinned. This wasn't cruelty, it was scale. Systems designed for efficiency struggled to process the volume and complexity of claims flooding in from multiple directions at once. The result was a growing gap between what policies promised on paper and what people experienced in reality. At the same time, reinsurance markets, the layer of insurance that insures insurers, tightened. When risk becomes harder to distribute globally, it concentrates locally. That pressure flowed downward, directly into household bills. By 2026, this cascade effect meant that even well-managed insurers had fewer options. They raised prices, reduced exposure, or exited certain markets altogether. For consumers, it felt abrupt and personal. For the system, it was defensive. The defining feature of this year wasn't panic, it was recalibration. People adjusted expectations. They stopped assuming stability and started planning for volatility. Conversations shifted from "am I covered?" to "what can I survive without filing a claim?" That change in mindset is profound. It alters behavior, priorities, and long-term decisions. Homes weren't upgraded, they were preserved. Healthcare wasn't optimized, it was delayed. Driving became cautious not out of courtesy, but out of financial fear. This is why 2026 stands out as the breaking year. Not because the system collapsed, but because it stopped pretending. The gap between risk and protection became visible, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. Insurance revealed its limits at the exact moment people needed it to feel limitless. And in that quiet exposure, something fundamental shifted. The understanding that the safety net most Americans relied on was no longer built to catch everyone, only to price the fall. By the time this shift fully settled in, its most powerful effects were no longer visible in spreadsheets or renewal notices. They were visible in behavior. The insurance breakdown didn't announce itself through mass cancellations or dramatic exits from the system. It showed up in the small, careful choices people made every day to avoid triggering it. Life became more conservative, not in ideology, but in movement. People learned to live more cautiously, not because they wanted to, but because risk had become unaffordable. By 2026, many Americans were technically insured and functionally exposed at the same time. Policies existed, premiums were paid, and yet the sense of protection was gone. A fender bender no longer felt like an inconvenience, it felt like a financial event with consequences that could last years. A medical issue wasn't just a health concern, it was a negotiation with uncertainty, billing codes, and thresholds that few fully understood. Even home maintenance took on a different tone. Problems weren't fixed when they appeared. They were monitored, delayed, and weighed against the possibility that involving insurance could make things worse instead of better. This constant calculation reshaped everyday psychology. People didn't talk about it openly, but it was there in the pauses, the hesitations, the quiet stress that followed ordinary incidents. The safety net that once allowed people to take risks, recover, and move forward had become a system that demanded caution at every step. In a society built on mobility and resilience, that shift mattered. It slowed people down, it made them defensive. It reduced the margin for error in lives that already felt tight. Healthcare is where this change became most visible. By 2026, many people delayed care not because they were reckless, but because they were uncertain. They weren't sure what would be covered, what would be denied, or how high the final bill might climb. Preventive visits were postponed, minor symptoms were ignored. Decisions that should have been medical became financial first. Insurance, which was meant to make care accessible, instead became another layer of friction between people and treatment. The result wasn't dramatic collapse, but gradual harm, conditions that worsened quietly, costs that grew heavier later. Housing followed a similar pattern. Homeowners stayed put longer, not out of comfort, but out of fear. Renovations slowed, claims were avoided, people absorbed damage themselves when they could, even when it strained their savings, because the long-term risk of higher premiums felt worse than the immediate expense. Renters felt it too, through higher rents, reduced coverage options, and landlords passing costs down indirectly. The insurance system didn't just affect policyholders. It reshaped entire neighborhoods by altering how people maintained and invested in where they lived. Even mobility changed. Driving became a source of background stress. People chose routes, schedules, and behaviors with insurance consequences in mind. Some delayed replacing older vehicles, others drove less, not for environmental reasons, but to minimize exposure. The freedom associated with movement, the core part of American life, quietly narrowed. Risk wasn't eliminated, it was internalized. What makes this moment so consequential is that none of these changes required formal announcements. There were no laws declaring reduced protection, no speeches explaining a new reality. The system didn't need to tell people to adapt. It forced adaptation through cost and uncertainty. And because each person adjusted individually, the transformation looked like personal choice rather than structural pressure. That's how the deepest shifts happen, quietly, without resistance, until they become normal. By the end of 2026, the insurance crisis had done something more subtle than collapse trust. It altered expectations. People stopped assuming recovery was guaranteed. They planned lives with less room for error, fewer risks, and more caution. The safety net didn't disappear, but it thinned enough that falling felt dangerous again. And once the society begins living as if there is no cushion beneath it, everything changes: ambition, mobility, health, and hope itself.